Okay, so it's been a while since I've done one of these reaction videos, and I just wanted to um, look at what the Chancellor had to say regarding what she's foreshadowing, I suppose, with respect to the autumn budget. Um, it doesn't sound very good in terms of what I'm hearing online and in the algorithm and just generally on the news. But obviously, I just wanted to have a look at this for myself. And what I would suggest is that you do watch this for yourself and form your own view. This is something that I understand is not something that's very common. So normally the chancellors just wait till the actual budget before saying whatever it is they want to say. But it sounds like Rachel Reeves wants to let us down gently, I suspect, in terms of what many people are fearing. So let's get into this and see what all the fuss is about.
Good morning. Later this month, I will deliver my second budget as Chancellor of the Exchequer. At that budget, I will make the choices necessary to deliver strong foundations for our economy. My budget...
Yeah, so it's interesting because this is only her second budget, and I'm not sure how many budgets chancellors get to do. Um, but it is I just think about many jobs people have where they only get two chances to do something, and on the second attempt, it seems to be worse than the first attempt. So I just thought that was quite funny. Anyway, let's carry on.
Led by this government's values of fairness and opportunity, and focused entirely on the priorities of the British people, protecting our NHS, reducing our national debt, and improving the cost of living. There is a lot of speculation about the choices that I will make. I understand that. These are important choices that will shape the future of our country for years to come. I want people to understand the circumstances we are facing, the principles guiding my choices, and why I believe they will be the right choices for our country.
And I think that's a fair opening statement from my perspective. She can only give her position on this, obviously taking into consideration anything she's hearing from her, constituents, for example, any think tanks she's discussing these matters with. But I think in terms of her point around speculation, I do find it odd that she almost detaches herself from this speculation, because much of the speculation has actually come from basically the government. We've heard a lot of things about cash ISAs, for example. We've heard a lot of things about rental tax reform. She obviously talked in her Mansion speech, which I covered not too long ago, about some of the things she wanted to do. She didn't talk about taxes, but there were some of the things she did want to do with respect to improving, the economy in terms of bringing down the cost of borrowing, for example, making financing more available. So a lot of this speculation hasn't just come from nowhere. And I think the government is partially responsible for that because they've never actually tried to control the narrative in terms of what the media and other sort of economic commentators have talked about in this space. So for me, I think it's a problem partially of Labour's own making in this regard.
We are a country with considerable economic strengths, an open trading economy, a global hub for cutting-edge industries from AI to biotech, with world-leading universities and scientific institutions, and a talented and a committed workforce. But years of economic mismanagement has limited our country's potential, with long-term issues continually unchecked and potential unrealised.
Yeah, again, I don't like this narrative, and it's something that many chancellors lean on, and they talk about mismanagement in the past and failures of their predecessors, as though these people were not present. So Rachel Reeves would have been in opposition. So let's assume she's correct, right? Um, she would have been in the opposition party, a member of the opposition party at the time. And now as Chancellor, it seems as though this is news to her, this mismanagement that she's describing. But it's something everybody has known for quite some time, if that was the view they had, and it's certainly something she would have known as well. This is not new information, and I'm not sure why it's being presented as something that is new. Well, we know why it's being presented as something that is new, but I'm not sure why objectively anybody would consider this information or this assessment new if that was your opinion, because the data and the information was always there to make that judgment one way or the other. So I think that the sort of theme I'm noticing with Rachel Reeves and the Labour Party in general is that they always seem to be the last to know when it comes to things like this. Like many other people have predicted some of the issues I'm sure she's going to go on to talk about and some of the challenges she's going to have in terms of, sticking to the pledges not to raise income taxes on workers, for example, whilst at the same time growing the economy and bringing down debt. These are all things people were cynical about. These are all things the opposition were calling out. These are all things that people were aware of. And we were less informed than she would have been regarding the state of the economy and what is actually possible. So I do find it odd that they're taking this position of sort of feigned ignorance, if I'm being honest, around some of these matters and the potential implications of what some of these issues would have been for them when they come into government.
Last year, I fixed the foundations, dealing with the aftermath of Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget and the £22 billion black hole in the public finances left by the previous government. I put our public finances back on a firm footing, provided an urgent cash injection into our faltering public services, and began rebuilding our economy. But since that budget, the world has thrown even more challenges our way. The continual threat of tariffs has dragged on global confidence, deterring business investment and dampening growth. Inflation has been too slow to come down, as supply chains continue to be volatile, meaning the costs of everyday essentials remain too high. And the cost of government borrowing has increased around the world, a shift that Britain, with our high levels of debt left by the previous government, has been particularly exposed to.
So all of what she's saying is valid. And I think this comes back to the point around people discussing competence. So when you think about the public sector and the private sector and this differential between competence potentially and allegedly, right? It's not a view I share, but this kind of rhetoric does not help the case for those who have this view around the fact that people in government are less competent. Because there's no scenario you enter into, whether you're in business or running a country, where the future is known, where the variables remain constant. And what you would expect is that there is an element of scenario and stress testing, certainly with matters of supply chain, for example, which would be tied back to national security. So I do accept that a lot of these things would not be known, but would they have not produced a scenario that may have anticipated this worst case scenario and therefore have some sort of contingency or plan around that? Now, maybe that's me being naive, but I do find this position quite odd. Why is she making decisions, or the Labour government making decisions, on the basis of things remaining indefinitely as they are? That is not the way you go about, financially planning in the private sector. I don't think it's the way even in local government they approach financial planning. So I'm not sure why this is an acceptable position if you are looking after the national budget.
And in an uncertain world, we also face pressure to increase our defence spending, and it is right that we do that, protecting ourselves from hostile actors and supporting our allies.
That's fine, but then the question would be, what can a country afford when thinking about bolstering its defense budget, right? So these are all things that you would imagine are affordable in the same way you would look at benefits, for example. And I do appreciate there's things I don't know about national security and what those requirements are. But ultimately, if you don't have the money for something, you shouldn't be spending it. Um, and I think for me, that would be my question here. Um, the fact that she's suggesting that national spending on defense is a factor here would suggest that they haven't really considered properly what is needed in terms of public financing, and budgeted for it effectively and allowed wiggle room for the things I've just described around what happens if interest rates change, what happens if your supply chain isn't impacted by tariffs, for example, which was always possible and was something that Donald Trump had always been talking about for quite some time, even before he was elected, I think. So the fact that he introduced tariffs was not a surprise to many people. It was something he was looking to do because he felt like world trade arrangements disadvantaged the US. And he'd always taken that position. And he'd always taken a protectionist position regarding the US as a consumer, as a global consumer. So again, these are things that were always a possibility, even if they were not definitively known. So again, I do find her positioning very strange.
And there are other pressures on the public finances. The Prime Minister, the Secretary of Work and Pensions, and this whole government are committed to reforming our welfare state so that it is not a system that counts the costs of failure, but one that invests in success and protects those who need it most. There is nothing progressive about refusing to reform a system that is leaving 1 in 8 young people out of education or employment. So we have begun the job of creating a system that protects people who cannot work and empowers those who can.
Okay, so I don't know the details behind this welfare reform, but I think in times where there is pressure on public finances, and there's no question about this, it is right to look at what is affordable. In the same way I made this point about defense spending, which arguably there's a higher need to prioritize that depending on what is going on with the state of the world, which I don't know. But when it comes to benefits and welfare in particular, again, this very much has to be tied back and balanced with what is affordable. And that obviously ties back to tax receipts, and that obviously ties back to um, economic growth. What is this pool of money, wealth that's been created from which you can tax? And we'll come on to the tax piece separately, I think, because I think what I'm hearing regarding what she's saying is about fairness, and doing things that are fair. And I have my own views about this, and I do want to see what she has to say throughout this speech before I give my view on this. Um, but I think for me, that is something else, that is right to think about. Like, as I say, it's right to think about what the country can afford. But my hope is that it doesn't hurt people too much, because people that are on benefits, there's a reason why they need to be on those benefits, and even those that work are still struggling with the cost of living, and therefore rely on those benefits to make sure that they can sort of live their day-to-day lives and have a chance of this economic and social mobility, which is always the hope in countries in the Western world. You start in one place, you may be born into something, but then you have the opportunity through social support and economic support, such as welfare, to then make that transition from a state where you don't have so much into a situation where you are able to provide for yourself.
That feeling, shared by millions of people across the country, that the economy isn't working as it should. Alongside the budget this month, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the UK's public finance watchdog, will set out the conclusions of their review of the supply side of the UK economy. I will not preempt those conclusions, But it is already clear that the productivity performance that we inherited from the last government is weaker than previously thought.
Okay, so she just contradicted herself. So she said she wouldn't preempt the findings of that report, but she did preempt that the previous administration is their fault, right? So it'll be interesting to see when these reports come out that she commissioned, if it says something contradictory to what she's just said. And this is what I find very interesting about things like these commissions, where, you know, there is an agenda, I find, with many of many of the reasons why they've decided to have the commission, i.e., there's a hypothesis which they believe to be correct, um, i.e., the supply chain has been damaged by the previous, establishment, the previous government. Let's do a commission to find out if I'm correct. And obviously, in my mind, there's a clear conflict around what those individuals are tasked to do, to basically substantiate or justify the fact that you've done or spent money on this commission. So as I say, it's just very, very odd that despite the fact that this hasn't been concluded yet, she's confident enough in public to send another political shot, to her opponents.
A less productive economy is one that produces less output per hour worked. That has consequences for working people, for their jobs, and for their wages.
Okay, so that's an interesting definition of productivity. I think from my perspective, there's two ways of thinking about this. There's absolute productivity, so that's the amount you produced overall, and then there's efficiency, which is kind of what I think, how I view what she's just described, right? So the more efficient you are, the more you can produce with less input. And to me, they're kind of different measures, in a way, slightly different measures. So she's right to call out that if for the amount of investment we're putting in, we're getting less out of it, that is bad for productivity. That is worse productivity. But the reality is, it's still possible in that scenario to be more productive overall than you were previously. And those two things don't necessarily contradict themselves. And I think it's important to understand that distinction between the two. And I think the reason why she's describing it in the way she is, which is probably more helpful than the way I think about it, is because the input side is probably borrowing. And in that scenario, GDP as a percentage of borrowing is something that she has to be, really keeping a tight eye on. So I think for me, I don't view things the way she does, but actually, I think, she is potentially thinking about this in the right way if that input side of things is relating to investment and borrowing in that equation she's just described.
And it has consequences for the public finances too, in lower tax receipts. It's not a question of how hard people work. Poor productivity means that we're putting in more, but getting out less.
So again, I think that's an efficiency measure. Is poor product efficiency would be my view. And coming back to the point around tax receipts, just because there's more productivity doesn't necessarily lend itself to more tax receipts if all of that income isn't taxed. And that's kind of what I want to talk about towards the end, once I've had the opportunity to listen to everything she has to say here. But not all wealth creation, not all income is actually being subject to tax. So that is something that, again, so basically what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is that in order to see the benefit of increased tax, your tax collection system also has to be as efficient as your productivity growth engine. And if they're misaligned, then essentially you're not going to benefit as a government from the increased productivity.
It means too many businesses and workers don't have the tools that they need. Trains that run on time, broadband that's fast and reliable, access to new technologies, or proper training so people have the right skills for the job. For a long time, commentators have talked about Britain's productivity puzzle. But it's not a puzzle. The causes of our economic underperformance are well understood. The chronic stop-go cycle of public investment has left us with roads full of potholes, high energy prices, and unstable conditions for vital business investment in skills and technology.
Yeah, I that's fine. Um, Not having the investment to do these things, and I think everybody understands that. But the other issue is leaving all the tax on the table, right? So if not everybody that could be paying tax is paying tax, then that also means you have to borrow more. And if you have to borrow more when you don't want to, or when borrowing terms are unfavorable, because, for example, the cost of borrowing for the government and gilts or bonds have gone up, then there's less appetite to do things as frequently as you should, such as roadside maintenance. So it's not enough to just say, well, the previous government didn't invest enough, because they had probably had the same challenge this government has in terms of, well, okay, we don't want to borrow too much because we don't want to have this increasing deficit. We don't really want to tax workers too much because they are taxed a lot. So the easiest thing to do in that scenario, certainly from a local government perspective, is to say, okay, can we get away with doing less road maintenance? Can we try and get a contractor that will do it at a lower cost? But if you get it at a lower cost, maybe there's less quality. So it's not as simple as saying, well, the previous government didn't bother to invest, as though they didn't have mitigating circumstances to deal with, as she is now facing herself now. So we have to judge any government using the same yardsticks, is basically what I'm trying to say here. So again, it just comes back to this scenario of, well, I'm not as bad as the other guys. And I think for most of us, it's a very tiresome argument, unfortunately, for the Chancellor.
And long-term failure to invest in our regions has built growth on a narrow base, with some parts of the country forging ahead while others fall behind.
Okay, it's interesting she's talked about the regional variances between economic growth there, because again, I'm thinking about the Mansion House speech I covered a few months back, where she was talking about essentially the finance sector more than anything else, and that was the key sort of observation I made about that speech. There isn't really much celebration or talk of other growing economies. So she did mention AI, for example, here. She did mention education, for example. But we haven't talked about the arts, for example. We haven't talked about tourism so much. I mean, that's sort of taken for granted, right? But again, and we haven't talked about HS2. So again, sort of building northern powerhouses. Um, so again, it's I just find it very, very odd, I suppose, that she's now calling out this regional difference, but many of the things that chancellors in general focus on is the city of London, and what I mean by the city of London is the financial sector. So again, I've not heard anything from any government that's meaningful in this space around leveling up, for want of a better word, other parts of the UK and diversifying um, where our wealth economically comes from outside of the city of London.
The truth is that previous governments have not adequately faced up to these challenges. Too often, political convenience has been prioritised over economic imperative. The decision to pursue a policy of austerity after the financial crisis dealt a hammer blow to our economy.
So, what were they supposed to do? I mean, under the current arrangement, I didn't hear an alternative from Labour. I mean, maybe I just wasn't there at the time, or I've forgotten. But after the financial crisis and also COVID, what else are you supposed to do? And it's not things I agree with. I have my own views on many things. But given the current reliance on income tax predominantly over everything else, um, outside of borrowing more, the only other thing, the only other lever I think you can then consider is, okay, your cost base, and your cost base, I'm afraid, is public expenditure, which is why austerity happened. Um, so if we were all happy to bail out the banks, if we were all happy with the furloughing arrangements and the transfer of wealth during that period of time and all the contracts that were awarded, then ultimately we kind of co-signed austerity as well. To be honest with you, um, and when I say we, I mean the government. Um,
Gutting our public services and severing the flows of investment that would have put our country on a path to recovery. The years that followed were characterised by instability and indecision, with crucial capital investment continually sacrificed and hard decisions put off again and again. And then a rushed and ill-conceived Brexit that brought further disruption, as businesses trying to trade were faced with extra costs and extra paperwork. All this meant that when the pandemic arrived, our country was underprepared.
okay, so the Brexit point is an interesting one, but technically we did that to ourselves. So all the government did was say, "Do you want to leave?" There's a lot of back and forth around what went on and what people were told and promises made, etc., etc. But the hard, cold truth when it comes to Brexit was that we, as an electorate, by simple resolution, decided whether we were informed correctly or not. And I think the responsibility was on us individually, to understand what this meant, was to leave. So it's no good the chancellor or any chancellor saying to that same electorate, "You screwed us over, so therefore it's your own fault," right? I can say that because I'm not in government. You can say that to me or whoever because, again, presumably you're not in government. But if you are in government, your job is to reflect the will of the people and work with the cards you have. So I think for me, yes, to a certain degree, she can acknowledge the challenges that Brexit created. But the UK is a very wealthy country still. It still has clout. It still has influence. And I think you have enough to do. You have enough there to make this work. And I think, depending on how you see it, unfortunately or fortunately, that is the job of the Labour government now. Now that they're in power, they just need to make it work. They need to carry on making these trade deals, as they seem to be celebrating in recent times, um, and look to re-establish that working relationship, for want of a better word, with their European counterparts, to work with things on, like, trade, their supply chain, which you talked about, immigration, again, sort of thinking about how they can work together to control the borders, and just getting that diplomacy back again. She has to be forward looking now, because ultimately this is what the people wanted, for good or bad, and she needs to represent the people that elected this government.
Our public services weakened and our economy fragile. And we finished the pandemic with higher death rates and higher debt than our peers. This isn't about relitigating old choices. It's about being honest with the people about the consequences that those choices have had. It is my job to deal with the world as we find it.
No, it is your job to deal with the world as it could possibly be, not as you find it, because that's a backwards looking outlook, right? As it is now, as she's just literally talked about earlier on, is in a constant state of flux. Things change all the time. What is unknown is, like, to be expected. What is the unpredictability is what would be predicted in a scenario if you are running a government, if you are running an economy, if you're dealing with things of national threats, for example. That is an ongoing situation. Yes, you kind of got to deal with issues as they arise, but you've always got to be forward looking as well. Um, so this reactive way of thinking about things is kind of where she's going wrong, in my view. Um, It's not the way you have to think about this, and you have all the resources available to you to support you with this. Because yes, I would accept that for an individual, that's a lot of pressure, that's a lot of work. There's no, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's one individual that can do all of that without support. But that's the way a government has to be positioning itself. It's like, okay, what do I know now? Let me try and deal with that. But what is also possible? What could go right? What could go wrong? And how do I manage that from a risk perspective? And that is how a business would conduct itself in a very simple way. It deals with what it can deal with now. It controls the controllables, but then it manages risks and seeks to take advantage of possible opportunities. And I'm sure this is what she's doing, but I think she needs to her language needs to reflect that as well. So I do appreciate I'm being quite harsh here, um, but I think we kind of have to hold these people to the highest standards, and that is why I'm being so harsh.
Not the world that I might wish it to be. Not to commentate or to speculate, but to act. In my Mays lecture last year, I set out our plan for solving our productivity problem through a programme of stability, investment and reform.
Okay, so again, I don't know the details of this productivity solution she had, but investment, reform, and I don't know what the third thing she said, I can't remember, on its own does not necessarily mean you get more productivity as she defined it, right? So just because you invest more in something doesn't necessarily mean it becomes more efficient. And I think that is how she was defining good or bad productivity. You can definitely get more productivity, but whether it's efficient is a different question. And again, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to that. So again, without knowing more details about what she means here, simply saying she fixed or helped the economy by giving it more money, essentially, and more support, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get in a situation where you have a more efficient growth engine from an economic perspective.
Chancellor, I began to put that plan into action, stabilising our public finances, making the tax and spending decisions to get debt down and to fund our public services sustainably, changing the fiscal rules to increase public investment by £120 billion over the course of this Parliament, and crowding in private investment too, for road and for rail, for housing and nuclear power, and reforming our economy, ripping up the planning rules so we can build housing and infrastructure right across the country, bringing the brightest and the best to our shores with a new visa regime.
So she talks about the economy being reformed. Reform. Um, it doesn't feel very different to me. Again, I'm not an expert in this space. I've not really examined, sort of the building blocks of the economy to that degree to know if it's very radically different. But I'd be interested to get a view from people that might have a more informed opinion on this. The way the economy works and the challenges do not feel like new things to me. So I don't feel like this reformation she's describing. It feels like she's the only one that sees that. Um, because I personally don't understand how the economy is so radically different to what it's ever been, and more to the point, why it's more efficient if that is the way she views a good economy, a productive economy, right? Is it a more efficient in the way it produces growth? I'm not feeling that. I'm not observing it. I'm not looking for it, I guess, to be fair to her, but I'm not seeing any anecdotal evidence of this. So again, I will have to check, sort of the validity of this point around the fact that she has radically reformed the economy, as well as obviously the welfare state.
And signing trade deals with the EU, the US and India to help businesses export around the world. We've begun to see the results of those plans in falling interest rates and falling NHS waiting lists, in rising wages and rising investment.
Okay, so those on their own would be good things, right? So reducing waiting lists is obviously good. A fall in interest rates is obviously good. Um, how much credit she can take for that is debatable, but technically she is meant to be independent as a chancellor from the decisions the Bank of England make. But obviously, the Bank of England, if they're reducing um, interest rates, it means that inflation is coming down, which is something she is trying to achieve. So in that regard, if you make that kind of tenuous link, depending on your opinion on that, I guess you can take credit for it, right? So I think
But I know that
so. I think all in all, broadly speaking, that's a relatively fair statement to be making at this point in time.
progress takes time. Our growth was the fastest in the G7 in the first half of this year. I don't expect anyone to be satisfied with growth of 1%. I'm not.
I think that's the point. Just because you're less worse than everybody else is not cause for celebration, and it's not a defense either, actually. So yes, it is silver lining. We're not doing as badly as others, but I also think it's not cause for celebration at all. It's a defensive position because you kind of know you haven't achieved the things you promised. It's kind of the way I read this. So that context is important, to be fair to her, and she was upfront about that because that would have been my question, right? What is economic growth for the UK? Ignoring how others are doing. So yes, you're doing better than your other G7, G8 peers, but how does that compare to emerging economies, for example, which typically, although being more volatile, can show higher growth rates? And that comes back to the point I raised about opportunity. Are you taking advantage of opportunities, or in my view, are you following a conventional growth model which other G8, G7 members are also following, and therefore you've missed out on that potential growth?
And I know that there is more to do. The first part of our planning reforms will add an additional £6.8 billion to the size of our economy in the next 5 years. But the next part, our planning bill, must complete its passage through Parliament before it can make a difference. Interest rates, which rose from 0.1% to 5.25% in the last Parliament, have now been cut 5 times. But at 4%, they are...
Yeah, so she talks about that increase, but I'm pretty sure if Labour were in government at that time, and I think this is what the Conservatives did, they just talked about the war, the Ukraine war, as being the reason, right? And they would also emphasize the fact that, again, this is a macro issue in many ways. Whether you accept that defense or not is a different question, right? But again, I think this is something that frustrates me, and I think it does frustrate other people where they judge themselves by different yardsticks, right? If it's good enough for you to talk about the unpredictability of the world outside of the UK, then I don't think you can take that same argument and lay the blame at your predecessors in this way, right? I think what many people, whether you're left or right, want to see is that consistent, fair assessment of government and accountability on a consistent basis. People being held to the fire, so to speak, in a consistent way. So again, this is why personally I get very tired of these sort of passive aggressive or even overtly explicit criticisms of predecessors when you were also, and I say you, I mean Rachel Reeves, she was a member of parliament in opposition at the time, and we did not hear too much from Labour about what they thought should be happening instead.
are still a constraint on business borrowing and a burden on family finances. Inflation is already much lower than the double digits seen under the previous government, And the choices I make in this budget this month will be focused on getting inflation falling.
So again, inflation also was linked to the Ukraine war at the time, because obviously there was supply chain interruption, as well as the oil restrictions. I think there was an embargo or sanctions on Russian oil, for example, which would obviously drive up the cost of goods and anything associated with that supply chain. So again, I'm not an expert in terms of what happened, but again, I do recall at the time the blame was being laid at macro conditions, global conditions, things you don't predict wars, even though again there are proxy wars going on all the time, all over the place. So again, coming back to my initial point around considering the most unlikely scenarios, outbreaks of wars is something that should be potentially thought about. Albeit, what I would accept is that you wouldn't necessarily expect or predict, I suppose, outbreaks of wars within the EU region or the European Economic Area, or necessarily Russia deciding to literally invade Ukraine. So I'd accept that as a very, very far-fetched scenario. But otherwise, the idea of wars breaking out is a constant reality, I suppose, and it comes back to what she was saying about increasing security and defense investment and defensive measures available to this country.
And creating the conditions for interest rate cuts to support economic growth and improve the cost of living. I understand the urge for easy answers. But politicians of recent years have become addicted to shelling out for short-term sticking plaster solutions rather than making long-term economic plans.
Okay. I don't think she's in a position to judge other politicians in the way she is. She hasn't proven enough or delivered enough to take this high ground. And again, it's something that doesn't sit or land well with me personally, and it feels very defensive, right? Let your record speak for itself. You can't keep saying I'm not as bad as the other guys, and therefore, even though because it just kind of feels like, okay, what I'm doing right now isn't what I promised, doesn't look great, but I'm better than the other people. I'm nicer than the other people. I'm more well intentioned than the other people. I have more integrity. This is kind of where it's kind of going than those individuals. I have more character, more backbone, and it's like, well, that's all very subjective. Your actions are the things that will lead us to that conclusion, not what you say.
They were irresponsible then. And those who continue to push for easy answers are irresponsible now. The UK's national debt now stands at £2.6 trillion, equivalent to 94% of GDP. Before the mini-budget, our borrowing costs were in the middle of the pack compared to other advanced economies. But now we have the highest borrowing costs of any G7 country. Today, 1 in every £10 of taxpayers' money is spent on debt interest. Not paying that debt down, but just paying the interest to our creditors. At the budget last year, I changed the fiscal rules to strike a careful balance, to invest more in capital alongside a credible plan to grow our economy and bring debt down within this Parliament. That was the right decision to break the cycle of low productivity and low growth. But that additional investment can only be delivered because markets know my commitment to the fiscal rules is ironclad.
Yeah, and I don't know why she's put these self-imposed restrictions on herself. It's not admirable. It's dogmatic, not pragmatic. And I think you kind of need to take a pragmatic view with many challenges you face in life. And certainly, if you're thinking about how you deal with a broken economy, as she puts it, and once she's fixed and reformed, a dogmatic approach that basically sets you up for failure if for whatever reason you need to in that in the interest, you know, of the nation, you need to breach those fiscal rules, you're basically in a position where you have to resign, even though you're doing it for the right reasons. So for me, I don't see any, I don't have any admiration for the fact she's imposing arbitrary rules on herself. You know, the aims are correct, but you can be pragmatic about how you achieve those aims without applying very, very strict rules.
Some people say that we should just sidestep those rules, that we can borrow more without consequence by simply reclassifying areas like defence or education.
So to be clear, I'm not saying sidestep the rules, and I'm not saying just borrow more willy-nilly. What I am saying is that placing yourself in a bind is restrictive and assumes you are aware of all scenarios and all possibilities, which I've just mentioned previously. You can't know what you don't know, and therefore you need as much leverage and wiggle room as possible to navigate the unknown.
But no accounting trick can change the basic fact that government debt is sold on financial markets. There are limits on the price that banks, hedge funds and pension funds are willing to pay for our debt. And we are competing.
So does the country serve the market, or is it in our interest? I mean, this is very odd. It sounds a bit like the tail wagging the dog, what she's describing there. So basically, we have to have these fiscal rules to keep the market happy, because basically we're borrowing so much from the market. So who is this market? And I think, you know, when I think about that question, I can't help but think about the likes of Gary Stevenson and what he talks about with respect to this relationship between an impoverished government and an increasingly wealthy 0.001%. So who is it that we are basically accountable to when it comes back to, you know, repaying this debt and or seeking more financing to grow the economy? It's a question for myself, actually, because I don't actually know the answer to this. But the language she's using, it kind of feels like the government is serving the market as opposed to serving the electorate. And by extension, our productivity is about serving the market, the financial market.
Constantly with other countries also selling debt. The more that we try to sell, the more it will cost us. It is important that everyone, the public and politicians, understand that reality.
I think I understand the reality. Oh dear.
The less we spend on debt interest, the more we can spend on the priorities of working people, our NHS, our schools, our national security. The public service is essential to both a decent society and a strong economy. At the budget last year, I provided our public services with a vital cash injection, and I am proud of that choice. Proud that it is a Labour government that is providing record investment in our NHS, getting waiting lists down by over 200,000 since the election. Proud that it is a Labour government that is investing in our children through the rollout of free breakfast clubs and free school meals. And proud that it is a Labour government that is funding our armed forces and remains resolute in our NATO commitments. The alternative is to row back on those investments, to return to the cycle of austerity and decline, which is what got us here in the first place, passing the cost of government failure onto communities and families, stifling our economic growth and weakening Britain's foundations in an unstable world. I will not repeat those mistakes.
Okay. But what mistakes potentially are you going to, what new mistakes are you potentially going to make, I suppose, is the cynic in me. You know, I'm not convinced the lessons have been learned, is basically what I'm saying here. And I'm not hearing anything she said that gives me a sense that she really understands the lessons and what should be learned. Because She keeps talking about austerity like it was a choice. So the only other choice would have been to borrow more. And it's kind of what she's just alluded to when she talked about the fiscal rules. In order to give the markets the confidence in the country to borrow at favorable rates, they need to see stability, they need to see certainty, they need to see predictability. And this is the issue with the Liz Truss era, right? She just kind of scrapped that rule book a little bit. The markets reacted very, very badly. And she, you know, she essentially lost her job as a result. So I think for me, the fundamentals haven't changed in terms of what is going on. Um, and to view austerity as a choice would suggest to me that the lessons haven't actually been learned. The issue, in my view, is the level of tax receipts, which is why there's an increasing dependence on borrowing, right? Why is a government finding itself in a place where it cannot pay capital on national debt? It can only pay the interest. What does it have to repay that? It's only tax. Those are the only thing that is the only thing that allows you to repay any borrowing. That is the lesson I think chancellors need to fully embrace.
But if we want strong public services in the decades to come, then we must recognise that productivity and efficiency are not only a challenge for business, they are a challenge for the public sector too. At the spending review, I announced £14 billion of efficiencies per year to be delivered by 2029. Cutting government spend on consultancies, getting rid of bureaucratic quangos and regulators, and driving efficiency through AI and digital technologies. But I know that there is more to do. In the budget and beyond, I will continue to drive for more productive and more efficient public services right across government, making savings and rooting out waste wherever I find it.
So Elon Musk, she's gonna be like Elon Musk. I think that's good. It's good though, to be fair. I think it's the right approach. What I would say is you should extend it to central government as well. I think you need to make. I think there's a lot of lords. I think there's a lot of well, I think constitutionally and democrat, and from a point of democracy, you probably want the number of politicians you have. But I think you have to look at some of the benefits they're able to claim. That tends to be in the news quite a lot. This is all small change, right? It's not going to move the needle massively, but in the principle of basically doing your bit, I think they need to look inwards as well. And I think they really need to stop paying themselves more money every time there's a pay review. That to me is just not acceptable in the current scenario where we find ourselves. So I think these kind of things need to be adopted, for central politicians or central government as well.
Now, my opponents will tell you that they could do more. Reform, who promise savings from our public services, and yet, in Kent County Council and councils they run across Britain, apparently they can't find a single penny, and instead going to increase council tax for more than 2 million people. Or the Conservatives, who promised £47 billion of cuts, when during 14 years in power they oversaw rising welfare costs and a growing civil service. What were they doing for 14 years? Let us be clear. There is no way that cuts on that scale, equivalent to cutting our entire armed forces, or cutting every single police officer in the country, twice over, could be delivered without devastating consequences for our public services. Austerity, reckless borrowing, made-up numbers. They are the problems, not the solutions. They are the mistakes of the past which would only take us backwards. I will not repeat them. When I was appointed Chancellor, people put their faith in me to take our country forward. Not to be swayed by political convenience. Not to always do what is popular. But to do what is right. At the budget, I will continue to deliver on the priorities of the British people. Cutting NHS waiting lists, cutting the national debt, and cutting the cost of living.
That's good, but I think, and I think she does understand this. the cost of living, part of that equation is income tax. That is also, or any tax actually, but certainly income tax, because that's a recurring month-on-month tax via the PAYE system. So interest rates and inflations are not the only consideration when you consider cost of living. But I think she understands this. But it's a point I do want to make here. She has her part to play if she's asking, for example, the Bank of England to lower interest rates.
Context of the long-term challenges on our productivity and heightened global uncertainty, any Chancellor of any party would be standing here today facing the choices that I face. The difference is in the priorities and the values that will guide those choices. Mine will be a budget for growth, with fairness at its heart.
I think any UK budget chancellor, seeing as she's making this assessment and speculating on this, any UK chancellor would say pretty much verbatim what she's saying. It's one for growth. It's one for fairness. Like what else would they be saying? If they're a rational person that actually wants to keep their job. So this grandstanding and this sort of self-appraisal of how different she is from everybody else. She's different because she's a different person. But outside of that, there's nothing she's saying to me that I can't imagine any other UK chancellor saying in terms of what their aspirations are, certainly for the country, right? How you get there, I would agree, is different. What your value systems are will guide how you implement that. But your end goal will probably be the same, because ultimately that is the function of your job as chancellor. So what else could she be saying? You know, it's just very odd to me. Anyway.
And a budget that supports businesses to create jobs and to innovate. As I take my decisions on both tax and spend, I will do what is necessary to protect families from high inflation and interest rates, to protect our public services from a return to austerity, and to ensure that the economy that we hand down to future generations is secure, with debt under control.
Okay, so if those are her priorities, she either has to borrow more or tax more. Like there's no way around it in my view, because if you're going to ensure, certainly the NHS, which is a massive section of expenditure, and defence, and things like police, which is an extension in my mind of defence, if you're basically guaranteeing those things, and to some degree benefits, although I think that's going to take a hit, and you are determined because of these fiscal rules to ensure that debt does not continue to balloon, you probably have to raise taxes. You probably have to. So the question is, and this is where it comes back to the fairness point in my mind, where are those tax increases going to be applied? So this is going to be the bit that everybody's interested in, despite all this fluff ahead of time. So everything up until now has sort of been like the appetizer, the starter, right? But what we all really want to know, 20, 30 minutes in here is, well, what the fuck are you going to do? What taxes are you actually going to raise, and who is going to pay for it? Yeah, let's keep going.
If we are to build the future of Britain together, we will all have to contribute to that effort. Each of us must do our bit for the security of our country and the brightness of its future.
Okay, so I'm glad she's saying everybody. Again, I'm going to be very pointed in raising these points. Everybody must do their bit, right? So again, we're foreshadowing tax increases, or I am at least. I think many people are. She's saying we all need to do our bit, and this sounds familiar, right? Those with the broadest shoulders. If anybody that's a bit older in the UK will remember that statement after I think it was the financial crisis, and they had to raise taxes. I think the Conservatives had to raise taxes, and it was those with the broadest shoulders, right? Now we're hearing everyone must do their bit, right? So again, it'll be good to understand who everybody is, right? Because if everybody is just working people, that isn't everybody. So I'm going to be very clear on this point. Those that receive a salary is not everybody. Everybody is everybody that resides in this country. Right? So that is my definition of everybody. But let's see what she has to say about this in terms of her values, right? So I don't think she's going to give details because I think she's kind of said that already, if I remember correctly. But that is her guiding principle. Everybody is going to do their bit, i.e., in my view, every UK citizen.
There is a reward for getting these decisions right. To build more resilient public finances with the headroom to withstand global turbulence. Giving business the confidence to invest and leaving government freer to act when the situation calls for it. To continue to invest in our infrastructure and our industry to build a stronger economy. And to get the cost of borrowing down, spending less on debt interest and more on schools and on our health service. The Office of Budget Responsibility will make their forecasts at the end of this month. But let's be clear about what forecasts are. They're not visions of the future. They're a look in the rearview mirror. The OBR rightly make their predictions based on the data that has gone before. But I do not believe that our past has to determine our future.
Who doesn't know this? Like, who's she talking to? Like, I think most people understand what a forecast is. Like, I don't think anybody looks at a forecast and thinks that is certain. Like, I don't know anybody. I mean, again, I don't know everybody, right? But who is she actually talking to when she makes a statement like this? Anyway.
Or that a stuttering economy, poor productivity and falling living standards is somehow Britain's destiny. A brighter future is within our grasp. We were elected to break with the cycle of decline, and this government is determined to see that through. So we will go further and faster on planning, on the industrial strategy, on reforming regulation, all to deliver growth throughout our economy in all parts of our country.
So far, growth has been 1%, according to her. So that is the result of all her reformation. And they're now going to go harder and faster. So I just wanted to interject and make that point. So let's see what we can achieve over and above 1% going forward.
We will bear down on waiting lists, on the cost of living, and on the national debt, which compound these challenges. And when that requires hard choices, we will act, guided by the interests of working people. We were elected on a commitment to put country before party, the national interest before political calculation. And whatever challenges come our way, whatever challenges come my way, we will not be swayed from that.
Okay, so I'm glad she's reaffirmed her commitments, but again, any government in a democratic society, certainly in Western countries, that is always the mandate. And unfortunately, when you look at the US, you're not seeing that because it seems to be a focus on Republican members. But what a president or a government should be doing once elected is adopting the wider interests of those citizens as a whole, and then working with the opposition, who basically are more aligned with those that voted but didn't get that representation, to make sure that what is happening is reasonably representative. So again, what she's saying is just a reassertion of what is the minimum of what you would expect. It's not something, again, to necessarily be applauding any politician for. So again, it's the way it's being positioned as this massive virtue, in a sense. And it's like, well, it's a basic requirement. We expect people to act with integrity, with virtue, if they take public office. It's not something I personally am going to congratulate someone on because they're meeting the requirements of the job from a character perspective. And it would be the same of any regulated professional. So if you think about a doctor or a nurse or a police officer, for example, again, you expect them to have high moral standing. And you're not going to think, oh, that's really impressive, because they do. It's an expectation and a requirement for the job, you would hope. So again, I'm not sure why she's making these points or why they're even relevant or why she thinks any of us care. It's something I personally take for granted. Um, it's what I expect.
At the budget this year, I will continue to build the strong foundations to secure Britain's future. For a fairer Britain, a more prosperous Britain, a Britain with an economy that works for everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, so she talks about a fairer Britain, an economy that works for everybody, one that grows. She's talked about protecting the NHS. She's talked about ensuring that we can defend ourselves. So therefore, there's investment in you know, national security and defence, and also making sure that we can borrow money on favourable terms by ensuring that she has fiscal rules and therefore we can benefit from obtaining financing from the markets, as she puts it. Now, I think for me, she talks about working people, um, and to me, it's kind of foreshadowing and alluding to the fact that the taxes will be on working people, right? And the question will be, and this is for me, this whole issue and where it becomes very, very divisive, is that they treat workers as falling into different categories, right? So you have workers that can't afford to get by. You have very high earners that are earning a lot of money relative to work. People that are on benefits even though they're working. And then what they'll say is everybody has to do their share, and they're only looking at that population of workers. Um, but what is well understood about people that work who are very, very wealthy, and now I'm talking about billionaires, and these are people that are in a very extreme end of that wealth spectrum, they are technically not workers. These are people that will pay themselves next to nothing. And I think it's in a video I covered before when talking about the budget, actually, where they pay themselves basically $1. It's like a notional amount of income. And it was something Steve Jobs popularized when he was running Apple, for example. So these individuals are not included in this workers population, and therefore any increases to tax rates, and there's been muted discussions around, well, not muted, but there's been rumors around the fact that she's going to increase the income tax rates at some levels by 1% or 2%, then offset that with an NIC reduction. These don't impact people that don't pay themselves, and if you have a lot of assets, you don't need to pay yourself. You can just monetize those assets because you have a huge amount of collateral that the banks will accept. And what that means basically um, is that any income you receive by virtue of disposing of any assets can be offset by any capital losses, for example, which are resulting from assets you sell at a loss. So you're in a situation where the income you do realize can also be offset by any losses you had. Whilst when you think about income and the way it works, you're basically taxed on gross, right? You get your paycheck, and unless you do a salary sacrifice with respect to pensions or cycle to work scheme, and these are things in the UK, for example. I don't know how it works in other jurisdictions. Then that is the base in which you're taxed on. There's no offset because you had to travel to work. There's no offset in terms of feeding yourself. It doesn't consider whether you're a working single mother with 4 kids and you're on 100K versus a 23-year-old who works remotely and is also on 100K. It doesn't consider these different things, whilst a capital gains implicitly kind of consider those different things, and therefore allow you to recognize asset losses as well. And this is one of the ways basically very, very wealthy entrepreneurs and billionaires, and these are the people that actually provide all the jobs, can benefit from basically just not paying themselves in a conventional way. So basically, what I'm trying to say in a very long, convoluted way here is that if this is a government that really cares about being progressive and being fair, and everybody doing their bit, then I just find it odd that of all the things she is considering, I've heard no explicit thoughts or conversations around a wealth tax, even just to dismiss it as an idea. So I've heard many commentators say we can't do a wealth tax, it's too difficult, it's too complicated. And these are all very respected, knowledgeable, highly intellectual individuals, right? And then you have people on the other side, people like myself, for example, who would say, actually, I think there is validity in a wealth tax. I don't think the issue of complication is a sufficient objection. And if anything, if you're focusing it on a very limited set of individuals, then the complication is actually warranted when you think about the upside, right? But the point is that debate needs to be had and concluded, and it needs those that are actually elected to be having that debate and presenting a position on that. And the only politician I'm aware of that has done that is the leader of the Green Party. Outside of that, I've not heard parties even dismiss the idea explicitly. And I think they actually need to do that. They actually need to say, as part of what we're thinking about, and I think Labour in particular, because they're in power, we dismiss the idea of a wealth tax, and here's X, Y, and Z reasons why, and get people like me on board and say, okay, actually, you know what? You're absolutely right. Forget the idea of wealth tax. I'm now willing to pay more income tax. I understand that the burden needs to be with us and not them. We all move on with our lives, right? But whilst they remain silent on it, this discourse will continue. People like me will never be convinced that they're actually doing the right thing when they look to tax income more and more and more, whilst also at the same time the cost of living is going up and up and up. So what fair looks like is yet to be seen. We will learn when the budget is announced, when we actually find out what the tax arrangements are and what the sort of increases are going to be and what she's proposing, and then we can make an assessment there. But what I do fear for the Labour Party, unfortunately, is that this is a situation, and it's something Kemi Badenoch mentioned in response to this, and it's hard to disagree, actually. It feels like a managed decline. I think that is an apt word I would use, and I would be in agreement with her. And I think it lends itself to that increases unpopularity and feeling of resentment and dissatisfaction that people have. There's going to be a lot of pressure to deal with benefits and welfare, to appease some of that dissatisfaction, based on what we're seeing from the right. But ultimately, I think come election time, Labour will still be in a position where the economy is failing, in the view of many, and people will seek an alternative. So let's see what the budget says. I think this was useful. Outside of this, I think there's just like questions from reporters, so there's not really much to cover there. But yeah, those are my initial thoughts, and until next time, peace.
We've been really clear in our manifesto about the taxes that we won't increase. And we're not going to increase the taxes that working people pay, their income tax, their national insurance and their VAT, because I do recognise the struggle that ordinary working people have faced these last few years with the cost of living. And so those manifesto commitments around income tax, national insurance and VAT, they absolutely stand.